I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon, everybody. I noticed we got the graveyard slot, but we hope that we'll go out with a bit of a bang. So the time has come. In fact, it may be overdue to discuss securitization and blockchain. And so I'm delighted to host this panel with Bryony, Stefan, and Michael. While we might be still at an early stage of blockchain for securitization, blockchain, along with smart contracts, promises to transform many activities in securitization today. The question becomes not if, but when. And I think when really starts now. It has the potential to streamline processes, lower costs, increase transaction speed, enhance transparency, and improve security. For all transaction participants, from issuer to agents to investors, auditors, rating agencies, and the like. Tokenization has the potential to partially replace securitization, if not totally so. As it becomes more mainstream, there'll be a period that blockchain and tokenization will coexist with what we know today and then replace some processes that we are familiar with. It promises to transform many activities in the securitization cycle and, if not, replace them. So none of our activities are immune to change. And there's certainly, some overlap with the work that's been done in ESG. If you'd come to this conference 4 or 5 years ago and talked about ESG also would have probably got the graveyard slot. And nobody really thought how it could apply to securitization. In fact, it was probably more like a pro bono, nice-to-have activity. And while ESG is in its infancy in securitization today, I think everybody who's done any sessions will have heard ESG more than once. And blockchain really has the potential to really help with the ESG goals, and we'll come back to that. But beforehand, we haven't got any Slido. We thought we'd go back to a very traditional approach and do a hand poll and ask if anybody in our audience feels confident enough to actually come on stage, put their hand up, and define blockchain. So, hands up. 1. Okay, so I'm going to ask Michael, with the help of a slide or two, to actually define what is blockchain.
So that was a bravery test, clearly, because there was a chap there who put his hand up. But
you'll just have to close your ears for this bit.
So, well, I think blockchain has a number of, there are different ways of approaching the definition, but essentially it's a shared immutable digital ledger of transactions that's duplicated and distributed across an entire network of computer systems on the blockchain. So, there are a couple of definitions up there on the slide, but I think essentially what it boils down to is it's a data structure. It's a data structure that's created by a computer program, and generally the computer program runs on a network of computers. And that data structure is stored on each of those computers as a distributed ledger, so each computer holds a complete iteration of the ledger. And that network of computers must reach a consensus, so they need to agree to add more data to that data structure. And when they do that, when they reach agreement to add more data, they add what's called a block to the chain. So each iteration of an additional block of data is a block on the blockchain. And then the whole ledger gets updated across all of the computers connected to the blockchain. So this is seen as being a means of ensuring that a number of participants can be viewing the same data across the same ledger minimizing the need for reconciliations between different sets of records. It can be seen as being a system for speeding up transactions because you're only updating one set of records, and reducing back office costs because multiple participants can view the same set of data no matter where they are. They're not having to do a lot of reconciliations. Now, there are different types of blockchains. There's what's known as a permissionless or public blockchain, which is open to anyone to read and write to and to participate in that consensus process. And these are viewed as, being less suitable, for example, for the financial sector because they're more open. There's less ability to control who can access the data, so it creates privacy issues. There are also permissioned, or what's known as consortium or private blockchains, where you will have an administrator or a consortium of parties that have the right to vet those parties that are admitted to participate in the blockchain, to view it or to add blocks onto it. And these administrators, these trusted parties, will define and administer the criteria for validating and recording information and transactions to the chain. And that's a system that has more utility in a financial services context because you can define different roles for different participants in the process. So you could have banks able to admit trades to the blockchain and have new blocks added to the chain. You can segregate who can see what data. You can have regulators perhaps viewing the whole of the data across the blockchain so that they've got transparency and any transactional data reporting obligations are easier to discharge to the regulator. So there are different uses and utilities that can be applied to different forms of blockchain. And we have seen a lot of different use cases being proposed in the past few years. So that's your sort of basic sort of overview of what the concept is. Should we move on to a slide to describe how it works? So you start, somebody wants to do a transaction. The transaction is entered into the system through the relevant portal on the computer that's connected to the blockchain. It's authenticated in the system, and then a block representing that transaction is created. That block is then sent to every node, so that's every computer that's authorized within the blockchain to validate the transaction. Those nodes then each validate the transaction. Typically, they may get a reward of some form for participating in that process, which could be a reward in the form of cryptocurrencies or some other token. Once the validation has occurred by all of the nodes, the block is added to the chain, and that update is then distributed across the network so that everyone's got a perfect copy of the updated ledger, and then the transaction is complete. Now, that process is said to result in an immutable addition to the chain, so that it can't be undone. But I think, as we'll come on to talk about a bit later, there's a difference between what's immutable in fact and what might be immutable in law. And I think years ago, when this concept was first mooted, we used to hear people saying things like, code is law. It's once the code has said that something has happened, then that's it. But as the lawyers in the room know, code is not law. Law is law, and code will have to follow the law. So we'll get into those details a bit later. So applying this concept and this technology to the tokenization of assets, we see the next slide. So asset tokenization is effectively the process by which the issuer of the instrument, in this case a digital instrument, creates a fixed number of digital tokens which represent a fraction of the original asset, which is then recorded on a blockchain ledger. So it could be any asset. It could be real property. It could be artwork. It could be, we've seen instances where it's, bonded barrels of, or wine, for example. It could be a commodity. It could be any asset. It's the the issuer creates the token that represents a sort of fractional interest in that asset. So the asset is split into pieces, effectively, and that digital representation is then called a token. Those tokens are issued on the blockchain, so there's no intermediary necessarily. You can buy the blockchain, you can buy the token from the issuer, and depending upon what the nature of the token is and its regulatory characterization, it can then be perhaps traded in the secondary market on a peer-to-peer basis or on a crypto token exchange. And the purpose of this is really to try and increase the liquidity in the relevant asset class to which the tokenization applies. So I've heard the term used, increasing the velocity of capital. So increasing the ability of people to invest in assets by making interest in those assets purchasable and tradable in a technologically simple manner. And those are the key concepts that I think we're going to, form the foundation for what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. Bryony, do you want to perhaps just give a few more examples of tokenization, bring it alive?
Yep, sure. So, hello everyone. Nice to see you here. I'm Bryony. I'm a partner at DLA Piper. I work in the fintech group, and I work quite a lot in the token space of token fundraising. But why am I relevant to this panel? When I was first a lawyer, I was a structured finance lawyer pre-financial crisis, and I've sort of slowly gone from that securitization pure world to becoming a fintech lawyer over time. So you see quite a lot of alignment and parallels and evolution, I think, in the two different spaces. So yes, in terms of examples, some categories were given, and I think it's important to realize there are numerous examples of tokenization projects already in issuance, in operation in the world today. But they do range, and there's a kind of a spectrum really of what I call more direct tokenizations and then more indirect tokenizations. And also there are different considerations depending on the asset that you're trying to tokenize. So it's a physical property or a physical asset, if it's an intangible asset, and then maybe if it's a digitally native asset, there are different considerations around how you might go about tokenizing those different underlying categories. So by way of example, I'm going to start with an old one. One of you may have heard of it. It's called Aspen Coin. It's been around for quite a while, which is why I just thought I'd bring it up today. It's a real estate tokenization. Well, that's what it's described as. And Aspen Coin gives you an interest in, I think it's called the St. Regis resort in Aspen. But in fact, what it is a tokenized representation of an interest in the REIT, so a unit in the REIT that owns the resort. So you can see that it's described as a real estate tokenization, but it's actually quite indirect in terms of how that, how structurally how that's been put together. So by contrast, thinking about something that's maybe a bit more direct, there's a commodities example that we could look at. So there's a company in Australia, a commodities business called Meld. And Meld issues digital assets, which it describes as digital gold. So it issues digital gold certificates. So they're a token. And they represent an interest in actual, physical gold, a particular weight of gold, and they're backed by it, and they're redeemable against that physical gold. So you can hopefully see that it's a tokenization of a commodity. It's more direct than the first example. Moving on to the art world, I can take an example from our own firm. So DLA Piper has developed in the last couple of years a tokenization engine, which is called Toko. And our Hong Kong partners got together to create the proof of concept for the tokenization engine. So they had some artwork made, a piece of fine art made. a group of them. And then they use the tokenization engine to create fractionalized ownership interests in this commissioned work of fine art. So amongst a group of the partners in the Hong Kong office, they own these tokens representing fractionalized interest in the fine art work. And finally, I think we should just mention natively digital assets. So you can't have failed to have missed all the recent buzz about NFTs, non-fungible tokens. So one of the clear and very current present use cases for non-fungible tokens is representing ownership in natively digital art. So digital artworks can be acquired by way of acquiring non-fungible token associated with the artwork. And there are some, amazing numbers, millions and millions of dollars for these digital assets. There are artists such as Pac and Beeple, do look them up. And recent auctions have been held at places like Sotheby's. So although it all sounds quite futuristic, it is quite present, and it's very real when you see the kind of the money that's associated with these structures already and some of these applications.
Thank you. I think we need to just touch on some of the advantages that bringing blockchain tokenization would bring to our securitization world. And I'm going to turn to Stefan for that.
Sure, thank you. So, I'm co-head of structured finance and take care of the European Office for Art Ratings. And as a rating agency, clearly we love lots of data, and also, we need to be sure around execution, risk of, securitizations, monitoring of information, but data is really key. So as you've heard, just the way that data is created, stored, and distributed by these distributed ledger technology is very beneficial, or potentially very beneficial for rating agencies. The data flow could be vastly improved and sped up, and it will enable rating agencies, for example, to get real-life, updated, immediate performance data for assets that are going to be securitized. Historic performance data, there's an audit trail, it could be validated, and it could in the future, for example, also be then fed into the rating agency model via a rating agency node. So for example, at ARC, we're about to launch what's called ARC Hub, which is going to be a platform for us to provide digitized tools. So again, it could be provide a very transparent way and very real-time way to sort of iterate transaction structures and asset compositions. But that's obviously a long time in the future, but I think overall tokenization really sort of, has other benefits such as eliminating the loss of sensitive data and just improving data quality overall and, transparency overall. Just a couple of other beneficial things. For example, many related transaction services could eventually be automated and thereby eliminating the need for intermediary involvement and thus having a huge impact on potentially de-risking these kind of transactions. Removing certain intermediaries as well could have a significant impact on reducing operational costs across the board, streamlining the process, and also just freeing up more cash in transaction structures where these type of costs would typically be taken out, very senior in the waterfall. On the waterfall front, then, talking about smart contracts. So smart contracts are really a piece of code that is introduced into the blockchain. And they can, so essentially you're reducing execution risk and increasing control of the structures by executing conditional logic, right? So you write in whether a certain event has been tripped or not, and then certain tasks are automatically executed thereafter. So that obviously has obvious applications for waterfalls, tests, triggers, etc., replenishment conditions, the type of assets that come in and out, and can all be automated via literally encoding the blockchain with these type of commands. Further on then, the surveillance side of things, clearly streamlining and having real-time monitoring information on the asset performance, will be available. So that really provides massive enhanced servicing capabilities. And well, while all of this is a little bit in the future still, I think, it's nice to strive towards these things. But what we first need to then also solve is really basically to provide the capacity of a platform for all these participants that are required in the securitization to be able to access these things in the future. So that's borrowers, lenders, service providers, investors, etc. So, that everybody has the right access at the right nodes with the right technology. And then once that is an availability, you can obviously see the upside potential and the increase of efficiency across the board. A couple of other things, I'll take a mortgage as an example. The mortgage underwriting process is still, although it is getting more digitized, it is still somewhat manual. So checks such as income verification, identity checks, assets of the borrower, credit scores, etc., could all be posted on a blockchain as validation of existence and of accuracy. So there's massive upside potential on that. Tokenization also allows for the tracking of the assets over time with associated timestamps, trades, ownership transfer of the loans, which has also got obvious applications for securitization. Further tokenization can also help mitigate concerns related to non-existent or double-pledged assets. So again, alleviating concerns over things like fraud or human error. Maybe just to run it off, so really the immutable loan level database and sort of implied audit trail can really help reduce the need for independent due diligence and duplication of efforts. So, it's sort of a one-stop solution of data across the board, and if implemented correctly, can really make a lot of difference and have credit positives clearly because of the real-time and live nature of the information provided.
Thank you. We're starting to get questions. It's really good. And perhaps not directly answering the last question about, what would be the most successfully funded in tokenized format. But going to that, and back to Bryony for a minute, are you able to describe to us real estate-backed tokenization and just quite how close that is to securitization?
Yeah.
Or CMBS?
The thing is, real estate tokenization can come in a number of different forms, and then we've even tried to structure sort of a few different platforms, depending on the way in which the asset owner or developer wants to raise the funds, the relevant funds, or the way in which, or perhaps the target market for the tokens, be it sort of a very specific market or be it more generic kind of retail market. It is connected, I think, as well to the first question, which I might just pick up whilst we're talking about it. Because if we took the difference between a real estate tokenization and a REIT, obviously one of the features of real estate tokenization is that kind of unitization. That is one of the aspects that you're trying to achieve by applying a token structure to the property is some sort of unitization or fractionalization, ability to own a fractional part or a fraction of rights in respect of the underlying asset. So in that sense, any fund or unitized holding structure can be seen as being similar, but a tokenization brings with it a number of other features, and a lot of which we've discussed in the context of what is beneficial about blockchain. So tokenization creates a level of automation within the kind of execution and receipt of the underlying rights in relation to the real estate that is not going to be present in the same automated way or without an intermediary way in a more traditional sort of unitized or other investment holding structure. real estate tokenizations can, however, as I'd mentioned when I was talking about Aspen Coin, be sort of direct or more indirect. And at the moment, we're really in a place where most jurisdictions can only really create more indirect structures. So you have to have some sort of ownership arrangement, and then the tokenization is being shared in respect of the ownership arrangement. And that's because you can't get into the underlying sort of land registry equivalent or the deed equivalent in order to begin to tokenize at that like asset ownership kind of physical level, right down at that level. But I think we would anticipate ultimately that that will come, and it's partly to do with the fact that, you know, market systems or registration systems need to upgrade alongside in order to bring this type of kind of very close tokenized functionality. So at the moment, you can tokenize an interest in real estate by reference to a specialized holding vehicle and equity ownership interest in that vehicle. You can tokenize returns. You can create a blended token that has a mixture of rights in relation to the real estate, and perhaps, you know, if it's rented and there are returns on the property. So it's more flexible and dynamic even now than traditional investment structures.
Frightening. However, it's not a panacea, and there are quite a few challenges to this, and therefore I'm going to go back to Michael, who is, I would say, expert at the infrastructure piece, to take us through some of them.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a partner in the financial services team at Hogan Lovells. I'm in the sort of financial services regulatory bit of the team, so I spend a lot of my time trying to work out what some of these tokens are from a sort of regulatory perspective. And indeed, that's probably the first step we always have to take when we're presented with one of these new propositions. I'm also, I do a lot of work with financial market infrastructure, so exchanges, central counterparties, and settlement systems. And that is relevant to the blockchain universe because, as Stefan was indicating, you know, some of the potential upsides or potential use cases for blockchain technology is to effectively disintermediate a lot of the current players in the capital markets by saying, well, you know, you've got a centralized ledger that's viewable by everybody, then, and if you've got instantaneous settlement, why do you need a central counterparty, or why do you need a security settlement system? And each of those two topics I mentioned do sort of raise regulatory and legal issues. The first is, you know, working out what the thing is in the first place. So, you know, there is no regulatory classification of a token. I mean, you know, the law and the regulation is drafted on the basis that it's defining the types of instrument that are classified as regulated financial instruments, and has been that way for many years. The UK regulators, in common with a number of regulators around the world, are stumbling towards providing greater clarity and perhaps introducing new categorizations of regulatory instruments that accommodate tokenized assets, but they don't at the moment. So they will say that, for example, what you might hear as a security token is effectively a catch-all term to describe anything that actually meets the definition of a regulated financial instrument. So you have to work through basically what the precise characteristics of this particular token are. And if, for example, it could be a security, for example, if it's a representation of a share in a company, that's a fairly easy one to answer. Sometimes it can be a derivative. Quite often we find that when, because of the way in which the token structures are set up, they can actually fall into being a unit in a collective investment scheme, much to the horror of the client who's come to us with their proposition, because that creates a number of other issues. So defining what the thing is in the first place can be a bit of a regulatory challenge, just because the law isn't fine-tuned for the world of blockchain and tokenization yet. And getting it wrong can, mean that, for example, you can incur criminal penalties if you are issuing or trading in or arranging transactions in an instrument that is regulated, but you haven't clocked that it actually is. So, greater clarity for how these tokens are treated from a regulatory perspective is a journey that we're currently on. But part of the challenge is that the technologists and the innovators coming up with these new ideas are moving faster than the regulators. There are always new iterations of how the blockchain technology can be applied to increase, or solve problems in the financial sector that the regulators haven't got around to fixing themselves. But marrying the current regulatory framework with the moving and changing pace of the technology is a challenge for those that are wanting to exploit this technology, because getting it wrong can mean significant adverse consequences. So once you've worked out what on earth it is and whether or not you need to be regulated in order to issue it or trade it, then provided that it is regulated, you then enter into the world of, well, how does regulation treat the trading, clearing and settlement of these instruments currently? And again, the law is defined around the existing framework of intermediaries that support the financial sector. So, and a lot of that law is basically has been developed in the past 10, 15 years as a consequence of the learnings from the last financial crisis in 2008, 2009, where the importance of, for example, central counterparties, the robustness and efficiency of central securities depositories, the role of regulated exchanges in monitoring and overseeing transactions was placed front and center by the regulators as being key to preventing the sorts of financial shocks that occurred when we had a number of banks get into distress in the end of the first decade of this century. And so where you've got a technology that you're trying, that you're saying can remove the role for a lot of those trusted market participants that the regulators put a lot of store on and which the regulatory framework is built around, that creates a lot of difficulties. One, the particular transaction that you're seeking to facilitate may require the involvement of a particular institution like a CCP or a CSD. So how do you marry that with the blockchain? Either you have to try and structure the transaction in a way that it doesn't involve that piece of infrastructure, or the infrastructure themselves have to become part of the blockchain process. So they have to have a role in the blockchain consensus process or in governing the process that ensures that the letter of the law is still met. So there's a big structural problem that as often needs to be met. The second issue is even if you were to find ways of avoiding the need to involve these trusted market participants, the consequences for doing so may not be attractive from a regulatory perspective. So CCPs, exchanges, CSDs have protected status under the law. The reason why the regulators place a great store in transactions going through these structures is because where a trade goes through or is settled through one of these systems, it has privileged status under insolvency law. So if you have a bank trading with another bank in an instrument and it gets into the system, but one of the banks goes bust before the trade is settled, the insolvency practitioner, so the administrator or the liquidator of the bank that's gone bust, can't demand that the transaction be unwound because the financial market infrastructure has a privileged position in law that says its rules take precedence. That doesn't apply with a blockchain-based system. So when we said at the beginning, code is, people are arguing that code is law, and you just add a block to the chain and that's it, it's immutable. Well, that's not the case in law. In law, a transaction can be unwound in certain circumstances, and a pure blockchain-based system without a financial market infrastructure with its privileged status in control of that system doesn't benefit from a privileged position in law. So a solution needs to be found to that, to actually to open up the opportunities for the use of this technology. And whether a solution is desirable from a regulatory perspective is whether it will introduce new systemic risk or reduce existing systemic risk. And that is a key challenge for the industry to demonstrate that you can design a system that is actually more robust than what we have at the moment, bearing in mind all of the legal protections that our current market participants have. So those are some of the challenges, and I don't raise those to dismiss the concept or the technology, because that's definitely not the case. It's certainly there's a trajectory here of more and more financial institutions and financial market infrastructures getting involved in this technology, trying to understand how it can be leveraged to improve efficiency in the market. But that does need to be done within the constraints that the law provides. And I think rather than there being necessarily a sort of wholesale replacement of the intermediaries in the next few years, what we're going to see instead is instances of the technology being used to replace certain processes where the law doesn't require that you do it in a particular way. And I think in particular, ensuring transparency of information, improving reporting to regulators is a key area where I think there's probably more gains to be had in the shorter term.
And the link, for example, to ESG, which is going to require reporting transparency, you can see quite easily why people like us may take time to actually think about this and thinking about reporting through the blockchain. Looking at your questions, there were a number of questions that come basically from an institutional investor, banker perspective. And actually, one of the questions that AFME IMN asked us was actually the investment approach to DLT, to tokenization. We don't have any bankers on our panel because nobody was prepared to volunteer themselves for the panel. And you might ask yourselves why that is the case. But nonetheless, and I think it's really important to think about what is happening. Earlier in the year, the EIB issued 100 million euros in 2-year digital notes using Ethereum. The EIB said that transaction was a series of bond tokens on a blockchain where investors purchase and pay for security tokens. If the EIB has done that, you can see that many other institutions of that type will be inclined to try the same. And once that happens, you can see that some of the very big corporates are inclined to do that also in the corporate space. Where you're seeing blockchain being used increasingly in small blockchains and actually banks coming to work together is in the supply chain area also. You can see that how useful it is to actually watch the supply of goods in that area. And actually our firm is acting for one of the manufacturers of one of the COVID vaccines, basically looking at the whole supply chain of the creation and delivery of one of the vaccines through the blockchain. And again, once you actually start doing that sort of thing, particularly in the reporting side and agency roles, you can see that coming very quickly. And when I look how young my audience is, certainly within the careers of many of you. And I'd like, I think, just to round off by asking Bryony to explain just how easy, subject to obviously all the difficulties Michael has put in front of us, of thinking about how tokenization could actually replace securitization, and just how quickly some of us might have to become token lawyers instead of securitization lawyers.
Yes, I think in trying to tackle this question, like really what is the crux, like the impact of tokenization on securitization, you've got to try and split the approach into two different ways. So one is incremental, and really that's what we've heard quite a lot about already in the presentation. You know, you start to replace bits of the service with DLT-based systems, and then maybe the issuer ends up issuing a token format of its notes that it would usually issue as kind of tokenized version of that. But it's really incremental replacement of parts of the existing structure, you know, and you could probably do that bit by bit as well. You know, this bit could go and then that bit could go, and over a time then you would create an overall blockchain-based tokenized securitization offering, but that's really very similar to current structures, but just with those parts all replaced out bit by bit. But I think there is another way to see this, and if you come from a tech sector, coming at it from a tech sector perspective, you know, that would be, it's just a completely different mindset. And that's a kind of very disruptive angle, a very disruptive potential impact that tokenization could have in this market space. And I think it's difficult to acknowledge from inside securitization, because the word that came to me when I was preparing was entrenchment. There's a lot of regulatory entrenchment. There's a lot of market entrenchment around, as Michael was pointing out, you know, the services, the provision, the kind of all of the parties and roles, etc. But some of the features of this developing crypto assets market really do have the power to significantly disrupt this model. And the features that are potentially relevant are the power of this peer-to-peer interactivity that's available through tokens. This exploration that's going on at the moment about what NFTs, that unique ownership reference, could be applied to in the real world. You know, that's got enormous potential. And then finally, when you combine all of that with the impact of DeFi, so we've seen a lot of expansion in the DeFi space in the last sort of 1 to 2 years. So I guess we just break it down to a really simple example. As we take a commercial kind of commercial property mortgage scenario. If that commercial property no longer needs to be borrowed against in the kind of mortgage loan way that underlies our standard sort of securitization structure, because that property is owned on a fractionalized basis through tokens that have liquidity on a secondary market, the token owners can stake those tokens or use those tokens as collateral in DeFi transactions, you know, instead of needing to borrow like a mortgage, traditionally structured mortgage loan. If that happens at scale and finance in that sense is disrupted over the basic asset class that underlies the overall securitization, then you can see that would have a significant impact on this layer of kind of investment financing that goes on over the top. So we thought we'd end with a bit of a revolution. And we've got 1 minute left. Yeah, we didn't necessarily answer all of the questions on the slide though, but you know, I think it's really fascinating, the potential for disruption on the underlying level, and how ultimately will that feed into the type of leverage and the leverage, you know, exposures that can be created over those then what are tokenized layers at the base.
Well, thank you, and thank you to my panelists, thank you to my audience. I actually hope, and I was thrilled to see so many questions. We're around to answer them if you are around to stay. Otherwise, perhaps in Barcelona in 2022, God willing, we won't have the graveyard slot, and we'll be able to continue this discussion. So thank you everybody.